My name is Nadia Ellsworth. I'm 31 years old. And the Thanksgiving evening, my mother-in-law lifted one of my candles from the sideboard and placed it in the center of the dinner table like a piece of courtroom evidence, was the night I finally understood that some people will only recognize the value of a thing once someone with a title has already named the price. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a production of it. She simply picked up the amber jar, cedar and black fig, a new scent I had poured that week and brought as a gift, carried it from the sideboard to the center of the table, set it between the gravy boat and the cranberry dish, and looked around at her family with the small, composed expression of someone who has just made a point without technically saying one. "This," she said, "is what she does instead of contributing." My father-in-law, Gerald, looked up from the head of the table. "A hobby is fine, Nadia. Nobody here is saying it isn't. But call it what it is." My husband's sister Deanna leaned slightly toward the woman seated beside her, a cousin named Wren who came to every holiday and said very little, and said something close enough to inaudible that I caught only the rhythm of it. The table responded with the kind of smile that doesn't require a punchline because the setup has been running long enough that everyone already knows where it ends. I picked up the serving dish nearest to me. I carried it to the kitchen. I set it in the sink, turned on the cold water, and stood there with my hands under the tap for approximately 10 seconds. I was not composing myself. I was simply giving the moment somewhere to go that wasn't back into the dining room. Then I dried my hands, picked up the water pitcher, and went back to refill everyone's glasses. What none of them knew, what I had not told a single person at that table, including my husband, was that 3 weeks earlier, a buyer named Simone Hartley from Caldwell Home Goods had sent me a letter of intent. Caldwell was a regional home goods chain, 42 locations across 4 states. The letter proposed a trial placement in 14 stores with a structured path to full chain rollout. The revised contract, held up by one clause my attorney had flagged, now resolved, was sitting in a manila folder on my studio workbench at home, waiting for my signature. I had been waiting to sign it until the language was clean. The language was now clean. I planned to sign on Monday. To understand why that dinner landed the way it did, you need the full picture of what the years before it had actually looked like, not the version the Ellsworths had assembled, but the version that showed up in the numbers. Theo and I had been married 4 years when that Thanksgiving happened. We met in graduate school. He was in the final stretch of a civil engineering degree. I was 18 months into an MBA program I would eventually leave. The decision to leave the program produced, in the Ellsworth household, the kind of sustained low-grade concern that never fully resolves into an argument because it is always framed, carefully, as love. Theo is not the antagonist of this story. I want to be precise about that because it would be easy to make him one. He is a person who is raised inside a specific set of values about what work looks like and what it earns, and those values were not cruel, they were simply narrow. He loved me. He also, for most of our marriage, described my business in the vocabulary his family had supplied him, which meant he described it as something smaller than it was. The Ellsworths, Gerald, Patricia, and Deanna, had built their collective identity around legibility. Gerald had spent 30 years as a structural engineer at a firm with a name on the letterhead, before retiring with a pension and a firm handshake. Patricia had managed the household with the organizational precision of someone who, in a different generation, would have run a mid-sized company and done it better than the man who held the title. Deanna was a vice principal at a high school 20 minutes away, working toward a superintendent credential. These were, in the language the Ellsworths understood and trusted, real things. Measurable things. Things with salary bands and org charts and endpoints you could name at a dinner table without anyone pausing to calculate whether they counted. When Theo brought me home the first time, I was 26, still enrolled in the MBA and running a side business, making small batch candles out of the kitchen of our apartment. I had been making candles since I was 22, and the origin was entirely practical. Certain synthetic fragrance compounds in commercially produced candles triggered the cluster migraines that came with long hours at a screen, and rather than eliminate candles entirely, I had started formulating my own. Friends asked if I could make some for them. Friends of friends followed. By the time Theo and I became serious, I had a recurring customer base of around 40 people, a product-dedicated social account, a consistent repurchase rate, and a clear sense of where the business could go if I gave it the room. Patricia's first encounter with this information was measured. She asked reasonable questions. What kind of wax? Where did I source the fragrance? Did I sell them locally? And the questions were genuine enough. But I noticed, in the way you notice a door closing quietly rather than slamming, that the word candles produced a specific quality of pause in her. A recalibration. As though she had been tracking toward one version of her son's future and was now quietly adjusting for a deviation she hadn't planned on. That pause did not disappear. Over the following 2 years, it calcified into a posture, pleasant, consistent, patient, that treated my work as a phase to be waited out rather than a direction to be engaged with. I left the MBA program 18 months into our marriage. I did not leave impulsively, and I did not leave because I was struggling. I left because I had been working with a small business advisor named Constance Mwangi for 8 months, because Constance had been reviewing my quarterly financials with the kind of rigorous skepticism that made her assessments trustworthy. And because the program was consuming 40 hours per week, I could no longer justify allocating to coursework when the business was growing at a rate that demanded the same hours in a different direction. The trajectory was clear. The math was not ambiguous. Patricia's response arrived through Theo, in the car on the way home from a Sunday dinner, approximately 48 hours after we'd told the family. Mom just wants to make sure you have something to fall back on. I told him I appreciated her concern. What I did not say was that the business had cleared $178,000 in revenue the prior fiscal year, that Constance and I had already restructured the pricing architecture to support wholesale volume, and that falling back was not a direction I had any intention of traveling. By the 3rd year of our marriage, the business had taken on the shape I had always seen it moving toward, even when I was the only one who could see it. I was producing approximately 1,400 units per month across 11 SKUs, 8 candle varieties, 2 reed diffusers, a room spray I had developed for a boutique hotel client who had found me through a lifestyle publication. I was operating out of a 400-square-foot studio space in a converted industrial building 4 miles from our house, a space I had moved into 14 months earlier when the apartment kitchen became genuinely inadequate, not as an aspiration, but as a practical constraint. I had 2 part-time employees, Rika, who had come to me through a referral from Constance and who handled all packaging, labeling, and outbound fulfillment with a precision that made her worth twice what I was paying her, and James, a junior at the State University 20 minutes away, who managed customer service correspondence and online inquiry responses 3 afternoons per week. Direct-to-consumer revenue for the prior full fiscal year, $312,000. Net margin, after studio rent, raw materials, labor, platform fees, and the quarterly advisory retainer I paid Constance, $91,000. That was the number I carried quietly behind my expression every time Gerald asked, twice a year, with the tone of a man maintaining a pleasant fiction, how the little business was going. I also had, by that point, 2 active wholesale conversations in progress. A small boutique chain in the Pacific Northwest, 3 locations, strong alignment with my brand positioning, had been sampling product for 6 weeks. A wellness spa group based in Scottsdale had placed an initial inquiry after finding my room spray through the hotel client. Neither had converted to signed agreements yet, but Constance and I had already done the work of restructuring my wholesale margin to make those accounts viable without compressing the direct channel. The Caldwell conversation began in February of the year before that Thanksgiving. Simone Hartley was a regional buyer who had found my brand through the Pacific Northwest boutique, a piece of information I only learned later when she told me during our second call. She reached out through my website contact form with a message that was brief and specific, which I had learned to recognize as a signal worth taking seriously. We had an initial call the following week. Then a second call 2 weeks after that, longer, in which she walked me through Caldwell's vendor onboarding requirements, and I walked her through my production capacity and lead time structure. She visited the studio in April, arrived 10 minutes early, which I also noted, spent 90 minutes asking about sourcing, burn testing, and shelf life data, and left with 8 samples from across the line. In May, she came back with her director. Paul Okafor joined by video. Simone was in the room with me in the studio, Paul on the screen.
He was direct.
He said Caldwell's buying committee had reviewed the sample data and the brand positioning and was prepared to move forward with a trial placement in 14 stores. He outlined the velocity threshold that would trigger the path to full chain rollout. He asked 2 questions about exclusivity and about my production ceiling at volume. I answered both without hesitation, because Constance and I had been preparing for exactly those questions for 3 months. The letter of intent arrived in the first week of November. Constance reviewed it within 48 hours. Her one flag: the exclusivity clause contained a 50-mile radius restriction that would have prevented me from entering into any agreement with a competing home goods retailer within that geography. There was a separate grocery chain conversation that had been in early stages for 6 weeks, not a certainty, but a real possibility, and the clause as written would have foreclosed it. Constance recommended a carve-out. I passed the request to Simone. Simone took it to Paul. Paul's team agreed to the revision the following morning without counter-proposal. The revised contract was scheduled to arrive the first week of December. Thanksgiving fell on the last Thursday of November. The candle Patricia chose as her centerpiece that evening was the one I called Millbrook, beeswax base, dried oak moss, a trace of smoked vetiver that I had spent 11 test pours calibrating until the throw was exactly what I wanted. Every person who had burned it told me, unprompted, that it was the best thing in the line. I had brought it wrapped in brown paper with a small card. It was a genuine gift. She unwrapped it at the sideboard before dinner was served, held it briefly, set the paper aside, and then, when the table had settled into the rhythms of passing dishes, lifted it and carried it to the center. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the sink. 10 seconds. Then I went back. Dinner proceeded the way Ellsworth dinners always proceeded, organized, well-fed, and structured around a conversational architecture that Patricia managed without appearing to manage it. Theo described a bridge project his firm was in the final stages of tendering. Deanna walked through the details of a parent complaint situation at her school that had required 3 separate administrative meetings to resolve, which she described with the satisfied precision of someone who handles conflict professionally and is good at it. Gerald mentioned that the neighbor 2 houses down had finally replaced the fence that had been a topic of low-level concern for approximately 2 years. Toward the end of the meal, Deanna directed the particular brightness she sometimes aimed at me across the table. "How's everything going with a small gesture toward the sideboard where the candle had been, now moved back. Candles?" "Busy," I said. "That's good." A pause that had the shape of something additional that she chose not to add. "It's nice to have something that's just yours." I told her it was. Theo's hand found mine under the table. I understood it as 2 things simultaneously: genuine affection and the particular apology that a person offers when they do not have the language for a more direct one, and I didn't say anything that would require him to choose between them. We drove home at 9:15. Theo said his mother didn't mean anything by it, and I said I knew, and both of those statements were partial truths, which was a functional arrangement. The revised contract arrived on a Tuesday morning, 4 days into December. I read it at my desk in the studio before Rika arrived. I sent it to Constance by 9. She called me at 1:30 with a clear confirmation. Every clause was in order. The exclusivity carve-out covered both the geographic restriction and a category exemption broad enough to protect the grocery chain conversation, regardless of how it developed. Payment terms were net 30 on reorders. The initial purchase order for the 14-store trial was valued at $87,400. I signed the contract at 4:47 in the afternoon, scanned it, and emailed it back to Simone's office. Then I sat in the chair I used for SEN evaluation, a low, battered thing I had moved from our first apartment and never replaced because I'd become superstitiously attached to it, and looked at the wall across from my desk. I kept a printed copy of the Caldwell store map there, 42 location pins across 4 states, 14 of them circled in red marker from the day Simone first outlined the trial geography. I sat with that for a while. Not long. Then I called Theo. He was quiet for longer than I expected after I finished explaining. "Then, you've known since November?" I was waiting for the contract language to be right. Another silence. "Nadia. That's a serious number." It was. We went to a restaurant we reserved for occasions that warranted it, on a Tuesday, which felt slightly transgressive in a way I enjoyed. Theo ordered a bottle of wine I told him was unnecessary, and then consumed most of it myself. We sat across the table from each other in the way that happens sometimes when something has shifted and neither person has fully processed the new configuration yet, present with each other, but each also quietly alone with the size of the thing. He did not call his parents that night. I didn't ask him to, and he didn't volunteer it. I did not coordinate the press coverage. I want to be explicit about that because the sequence that followed has the shape of something arranged, and it wasn't. Caldwell's communications team issued a vendor announcement in late January, timed to coincide with the first shipment reaching store shelves. It was a standard press release for vendor partnerships highlighted, a quote from Paul Okafor about their regional sourcing commitment, a brief brand description for each. Millbrook and Company was listed second. A journalist named Carmen Biel picked it up. Carmen had been writing about the local small business landscape for the city's alternative weekly for 6 years. She had a specific and well-developed interest in what she had once described in an author's note as the quiet build. Businesses constructed without venture capital, without institutional backing, without public narrative, by people who had simply kept working. She reached me through the Pacific Northwest boutique, which had passed my contact information when she called to verify the Caldwell announcement. We spoke for nearly an hour. She visited the studio 2 days later, spent time at the workbench, photographed the production shelves and the raw materials and the wall map, and asked questions that required actual thinking rather than prepared answers. The piece ran on a Wednesday in the third week of February, 12 paragraphs, a production sidebar, a pull quote from Constance about the margin architecture, and a photograph of me at the bench that I thought made me look like I hadn't slept enough, which was accurate, but which Rika said looked serious and credible. That same evening, the local ABC affiliate ran a 30-second segment on the Regional Business Report. They used the photograph from Carmen's piece, narrated 2 sentences from the article, and named the Caldwell partnership and the retail footprint. The segment ran at 6:18 and repeated at 11. Patricia Ellsworth watches the 11 o'clock news. It is a habit that has been part of her evenings since Gerald retired. The same channel, the same anchor, the same sequence every night. I did not know she would be watching on that particular Wednesday. I simply know that she was because of what happened at 11:43. My phone was face down on the nightstand. I'd been asleep for 2 hours. I woke briefly, checked the screen out of habit, saw the notification. A voicemail from the contact I had labeled years ago as Patricia, Theo's mom, a label I'd set as a reminder to myself of context, and went back to sleep without playing it. In the morning I made coffee, poured it into a travel mug, drove to the studio, sat in the evaluation chair, and pressed play. Her voice had the quality of someone who had prepared what they were going to say, and was delivering it carefully, monitoring for steadiness. She said she had seen the segment on the news and had found Carmen's article afterward and read it all the way through. She said she thought it was wonderful. She said she hoped Theo and I were proud, and that she had always known I was working hard, and that she thought perhaps we might all have dinner soon, now that things were, she paused here for one full second, going so well. The last sentence, I hope you know we've always been rooting for you. I set the phone face down on the workbench. Rika arrived at 8:30. I told her about the segment and the voicemail. She set down the box of labels she was carrying and made a sound that brought James, who wasn't scheduled until 2 in the afternoon, out of a phone call in the back room. The weeks after the broadcast had the specific texture of something accelerating past the speed at which I could describe it while it was happening. Carmen's piece was picked up by a regional business journal within 4 days. The following week it was cited in a national small business newsletter with a subscriber base I would not have reached through any channel I currently operated. Simone forwarded me the newsletter mention with one line. This is exactly the kind of coverage that compresses a rollout timeline. Paul Okafor's office called 48 hours later. The trial expansion was being accelerated from 14 stores to 28, ahead of the originally projected review window. The revised purchase order, $164,000. My direct-to-consumer order volume, which had been running at a consistent 1,400 units per month, doubled in 6 days. Not because of a promotion or a sale. Because Carmen's article had been shared across several communities I had not been actively targeting, and the demand had simply arrived. Rika and I hired a third person within the week, a woman named Bet who Constance referred, who who had spent 4 years running fulfillment operations for a mid-sized cosmetics brand and who arrived on her first morning already knowing the questions to ask about our pack-out sequence. I called my studio landlord that same afternoon about the adjacent unit, which had been vacant for 3 months. He quoted me a monthly figure I had been mentally modeling for the better part of a year. I told him I'd confirm by Friday, and confirmed on Thursday. Gerald called me on a Thursday afternoon. In 4 years of marriage, he had never called me directly. Communications between us had always moved through Theo or through Patricia. He asked how things were going. He said the news piece was impressive. He said he had always found the chemistry of fragrance interesting, which I understood as an attempt to locate a point of legitimate contact with what I did, to find a framing that made his interest feel earned rather than belated. I told him I appreciated the call. I meant it partially. Deanna sent a text message 2 days after the broadcast, saw the news. So great. We should catch up soon. I read it twice. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and went back to the expansion layout I had been working on with Bet. Theo was processing something during that period that I gave him the space to process without commentary. The pride was genuine. I am certain of that, and I don't want to reduce it. But underneath the pride there was a quieter reckoning, and I watched it happen across a series of evenings and Saturday mornings over the following 3 weeks. He was sitting with the recognition that for 4 years he had borrowed his family's vocabulary to describe my work, and that vocabulary had been consistently and measurably wrong, and he had not actively corrected it or replaced it with words of his own. He brought it to the kitchen table one evening without being prompted. He said, "I used the framework they gave me instead of building my own. That wasn't right." I told him I appreciated him saying it directly. He asked what I wanted to do about his parents, specifically about his mother's voicemail, which he had learned about and had not pressed me on for 10 days. I thought about Patricia's voice on the recording, the careful steadiness, the 1-second pause before going so well. The final line delivered like something that had been rehearsed enough times to sound unrehearsed. "Not yet," I said. He nodded. He didn't ask again. I went to the Ellsworth's house on a Sunday in April, 10 weeks after the broadcast. Patricia had made a standing rib roast, a meal she reserved for occasions she considered significant, which I noted without remarking on. The table was set with the good china, the pressed cloth napkins, the low floral arrangement she kept in a blue ceramic vase by the east window. The dining room smelled of the roast, and of something else I identified before I crossed the threshold. On the sideboard, in a clear glass holder that was not one of mine, a Millbrook and Company candle was burning. Cedar and black fig, the same scent Patricia had placed on the table as evidence in November. Theo confirmed later, when I asked directly, that she had purchased it. Not from my website. Not as a sample I had sent. She had walked into a Caldwell location, the one nearest their house, which had been part of the original 14-store trial, and bought it from the end cap display at the front of the store, where Simone's team had placed the Millbrook line based on the first cycle velocity data. She had paid retail for a candle she had once used as a prop to make a point about my irrelevance. I did not say anything about the candle. Neither did anyone else. Dinner was a different kind of ordinary than the Ellsworth dinners I was used to, the same structure, the same plates, the same passing of dishes, but with an atmosphere that had been quietly rearranged, the way furniture sometimes is in a room you know well, just enough that you notice the space differently without being able to name exactly what moved. Gerald talked about a documentary series on bridge engineering he had been watching, the Golden Gate's original cable specifications, a renovation project in Portugal, and twice directed a comment at me with the quality of someone who had decided, as a matter of new policy, to include me in conversations where he previously hadn't. Deanna described her school's spring calendar complications with the animated specificity that was her natural mode, and she was warm in the way Deanna was always warm, which had never been the problem. Patricia asked about the studio expansion. She asked specifically the square footage, the second employee, the production capacity increase, the timeline for the 28-store rollout. She asked the way a person asks when they have done some background reading and want to ask correctly. I answered her directly, without softening the numbers and without performing enthusiasm. I gave her the real picture because the real picture was good and she had asked for it, and I saw no reason to manage her reception of it. She listened without interrupting. At one point, she asked about Constance, how long we had been working together, what her background was. I told her. Patricia nodded in the way of someone updating a model. She did not apologize. I want to be clear about that, because the absence of an apology is part of the story. I had not arrived at that table expecting one, and I would not have known what to do with one if it had come. An apology at that point would have required her to name what she had done, and I don't think she had finished deciding what that was yet. At the end of the evening, after the roast, after the dessert Patricia had made from a recipe she mentioned twice was Theo's favorite, after Gerald had moved to the living room with the television on low, Theo went back to the dining room for the last of the serving pieces. Patricia was at the kitchen sink. I was setting platters on the counter to her right. She said, without turning toward me, "You built something real." I said, "Yes." She turned the water off. Her hands stayed on the edge of the sink for a moment. "I didn't see it," she said. "I know," I said. Theo came back through the door with the last two dishes, and the moment moved into the ordinary business of loading the dishwasher and finding our coats, and that was the end of it. No larger resolution. No formal reconstruction of the previous 4 years. Just that, 4 words between 2 women at a kitchen sink, which was, I decided on the drive home, exactly the right size for what it was. The Caldwell rollout completed to all 42 locations in September. Carmen wrote a follow-up piece for the Business Journal, shorter, focused on the production expansion, and the manufacturing consultation Constance had connected me with. I hired a full-time operations manager, a man named Darren who came from a regional food production company and understood scale without needing it explained. Rika's title changed. James came on full-time. The grocery chain conversation that the contract carve-out had protected converted to a pilot agreement in October, 14 locations, a different geography, a different margin structure that Constance and I had spent 2 months engineering. Theo and I went to my parents' house in Flagstaff for Thanksgiving. My mother has kept a Millbrook candle on her kitchen windowsill since the first batch I mailed her 3 years ago, before Caldwell, before Carmen, before any of it. She introduced me to 3 members of her book club as her daughter, who built a real company, and I watched the phrase move through the room without friction, without a pause, without a recalibration, and I thought about how long I had been carrying the weight of other people's frameworks for that word, real, without ever having been asked to prove it to my own mother. She had always known. Some people always do. There is a specific quality to the discipline of staying quiet at the right moment that you cannot fully understand until you have practiced it under conditions that made it difficult. Not the performance of calm. Anyone can perform calm for 30 seconds. I mean the actual thing. The capacity to absorb a room's assessment of you, set it down, and return to work without carrying it as a wound or a grievance or a fuel source. Just setting it down and moving. That quality does not arrive fully formed. It gets built in the same way that everything worth building gets built, in small increments at hours when no one is watching, through repetition that doesn't feel like progress until one day it clearly is. What you protect in the quiet becomes the thing that speaks when you no longer have to. If you were standing at that kitchen sink in April, 4 words between you, the candle burning in the next room, for years of holiday dinners behind you, would you have said more than Nadia did? Or were 2 words exactly the right amount? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you know someone who is building something right now in the hours before the room decides to pay attention, send this to them. This story is an original fictional adaptation created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, businesses, or events is entirely coincidental.